Walter Harlan sat on the creaky front porch of his log cabin, sipping coffee from a ceramic mug older than the HOA that now threatened him. The rim was chipped, the glaze long faded, but it fit his hand like a handshake from the past. His flannel shirt, soft from decades of wear, carried a hint of wood smoke and old pine. The porch sagged a bit under his boots, same as it always had, and the wind teased at the maple leaves overhead, loosening a few golden flecks that fluttered down like gentle warnings. He glanced at a weathered black-and-white photo of his grandfather building that very porch and muttered, "They'd call that non-compliant now, too." The picture stayed tucked inside his wallet, creased from years of folding, but it still showed the old man proudly standing, with a hammer in one hand and a cigar in the other, grinning beside a pile of lumber. Boone, his hound dog, let out a yawn that turned into a groan as he stretched across the porch boards. Walter scratched behind his ears, then rose slowly. The bones didn't move like they used to, but the habit of walking to the diner every morning, same time, same table, was as much ritual as necessity. The town of Asheville had changed plenty over the years, but Maureen's Maple Diner was still a safe haven of linoleum floors and bottomless coffee. Walter nodded to the counterstaff and slid into his usual booth by the window. Ginny and Red were already there, sipping their drinks with that early retired ease that let time roll by slower than the rest of the world. Red tipped his cap. "You hear they're painting the Johnson Place beige again?" "Third time this year," Ginny added. "Charlene's got some kind of color wheel obsession." Walter chuckled, half amused, half weary. "It's like living in a paint catalog." He finished his toast and folded the local paper under his arm. The walk home was brisk but peaceful. Boone trotted a few paces ahead, nose twitching. The breeze carried the smell of someone burning leaves, one of those scents that bypassed the brain and went straight to memory. Walter stopped for a moment to watch a squirrel dash along a power line, then turned onto Maple Lane, the place he'd lived for over 40 years. And that's when he saw it, a plain white envelope taped to his door. The wind tugged at his corners. He peeled it off and read the bold letters at the top, Maple Lane Homeowners Association Compliance Notice. The wording was cold and clinical, accusing his overly rustic exterior of disrupting the neighborhood's visual harmony. A list of required updates followed: siding replacement, window refitting, and removal of non-standard fixtures. The final line landed like a hammer. Failure to comply within 7 days may result in daily fines. Walter stood there for a long moment, the letter crinkling in his hand. Then he went inside, refilled his coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where the varnish had long worn away. Boone paced once, then settled on the floor. The next evening he made his way to the HOA meeting at the community center. The building smelled of lemon disinfectant and unease. Rows of chairs filled with neighbors sat facing the board, a long folding table with name placards and fake smiles. Charlene Prescott sat in the center, immaculate in a blazer and pearl earrings. Her voice was polished like the hardwood floors. "We're here tonight to address continued non-compliance concerns," she began, glancing toward Walter without naming him. "We have standards for a reason. Property values depend on visual consistency." Walter raised a hand. "That cabin's been standing since before this road was paved." Charlene smiled thinly. "Yes, and standards evolve. No one's attacking your history, Mr. Harland, but the neighborhood must maintain cohesion." "It's not just history, it's mine," he said, voice even. One of the board members whispered something to another. Charlene nodded. "The board has already reviewed the structure and voted. Unless modified to align with guidelines, it will be subject to fines, beginning in 7 days. Walter's chair scraped as he stood. "Then, I reckon, I've got 7 days to think." He turned and walked out without another word. Back home the evening was quieter than usual. He pulled an old file box from the cabinet under the stairs, rifling through yellowed papers until he found what he was looking for, a folder marked Deed 1958. He ran his fingers over it like he was shaking hands with an old friend. That night, Boone growls as someone shines a flashlight along the edge of the property. Elliot showed up 2 days early with a backpack, a drone, and a teenage grin. Walter wasn't ready, but Boone sure was. The old hound let out a low howl of greeting and lumbered across the gravel drive, tail wagging like he'd seen a ghost from the good years. Elliot dropped his bag and knelt to hug the dog with that effortless joy only 17-year-olds seemed to carry, while Walter stood on the porch, one eyebrow raised and coffee still steaming in his hand. "You're early," Walter called. "Figured if I showed up unexpected, you wouldn't have time to tell me no," Eli replied, hoisting his backpack as if it explained everything. Walter grunted, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "Come on, I've got oatmeal on the stove. Real kind. None of that microwave stuff." Inside the cabin, the smell of maple syrup and wood smoke curled through the air as rain tapped gently on the tin roof. Elliot set his things down beside the fireplace, eyeing the walls filled with black and white photos, old tools, and a clock that ticked just a hair too slow. "You haven't changed a thing," he said. "Or would I? It still works." Breakfast was quiet at first. Elliot stirred the oats with too much enthusiasm, splattering a bit on the counter. Walter pretended not to notice. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Boone sprawled at their feet. "So," Elliot said through a mouthful, "how bad is this HOA mess?" Walter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You ever heard of someone trying to fine a man for owning a porch with too much personality?" "That's what they wrote." "No, but that's what they meant." Later that morning, between the drizzle and the fog, Walter asked for help moving a few crates from the cabin to the barn. "Just tools and junk," he said. Elliot didn't mind. They worked in comfortable silence, one of them lifting with care, the other with energy. Back inside, as Elliot rearranged a rug in the corner to sweep, he paused. "What's this?" Walter turned. "What?" "There's something under here." Elliot knelt and brushed the edges of a warped floorboard, revealing a small iron ring. "It's a trap door." Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "That thing's been there longer than I have. My daddy always called it useless space, never really went digging." Elliot looked up, his grin crooked. "Can we?" With some effort and a creak that sounded like protest from the past, they pried open the hatch. Dust rolled out in little clouds, and a musty scent rose like an old song. Inside, nestled between boards, sat a small wooden chest, darkened by time, its hinges tarnished but intact. Scrawled across the top in faded ink, Harlan's 1864. Walter knelt beside Elliot, brushing his fingers gently across the lid. "I'll be," he whispered. They opened it together. Inside lay letters in delicate script, brittle with age, a hand-drawn map marked with red circles and arrows, and a leather-bound logbook. "Gramps," Elliot breathed. He turned the first page of the log. "This isn't just family stuff. Look here. Field log, supply lists. It says Harlan's aid station at the top." Walter stared at the yellowing paper. "That can't be right." "It gets better," Elliot said, flipping through with reverence. He pulled out a folded page addressed in thick ink to Commandant, Union Logistics Bureau, Blue Ridge Division. Walter sat back on his heels, the weight of it sinking into him. "I always knew my grandfather did something during the war, but I thought it was local, unrecorded. Well, now we know otherwise." Rain tapped louder above them, as if the sky were urging them forward. That afternoon, Elliot set up his laptop by the fireplace. Walter brought over a stack of documents and a lantern they'd cleaned earlier. Elliot connected a small scanner, the light from his screen casting blue hues across the aged pages. "You ever think," Elliot said softly, "that this place might actually be worth more than just memories?" Walter looked at the boy, his grandson, his namesake, and saw not just enthusiasm but conviction. "They'll laugh at us, say it's just old paper." "Or," Elliot said, eyes narrowing with that same grin from earlier, "they'll take one look at this and have to rewrite the whole HOA rulebook." Walter smirked. "We'll see." Boone thumped his tail against the rug, content. The storm outside passed into a hush. Elliot clicked a key, scanning the last document into a folder titled Harlan Cabin Archive. Then he turned to Walter, laptop still glowing against the darkened room. "Gramps, I think this place might actually qualify for historic protection." "Looks like your eyesore might just be a time capsule," said Ms. Ramirez, peering at the war log through magnifying glasses. She sat at a long wooden table in the Asheville Public Library's local history wing, her gloved fingers carefully turning the fragile pages as if they might whisper secrets from another century. Walter stood beside her, hat in hand, unsure if he was interrupting sacred ground. Elliot hovered near the printer, scanning document after document into neat folders on his laptop. The room smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil, and the rain tapping against the tall, arched windows lent the whole scene a reverent hush. Walter hadn't been inside the library in years, but it felt oddly familiar, quiet, wooden, no nonsense. He watched as Ms. Ramirez traced a finger under a name in the logbook and made a soft sound of approval. "You know," she said, This station was probably one of the last informal field posts before Union troops moved west. This isn't just interesting, it's significant. He said nothing, but Elliot grinned. Told you, Gramps. Ms. Ramirez looked up, her expression warm beneath scholarly focus. If what you have here lines up with county and federal archives, and from the look of it, it might, you could be eligible for emergency review status under the North Carolina Historic Registry. Walter raised an eyebrow. What does that mean in plain English? It means your cabin could be protected, even temporarily, while the state completes its review. No one could touch it. Not a wrecking crew, not an overreaching HOA. The words hung in the air like a window cracking open. Elliot clicked something on his laptop. I already filled out a starter request form online. We just need to submit physical copies and a basic narrative. Miss Ramirez smiled. You're one step ahead. Send me the scans. I'll help cross-resection them with existing Civil War logistics records. That evening, back at the cabin, Walter stood by the fireplace, watching Elliot tape an 8x10 copy of the 1864 letter above the mantel. The fire snapped and hissed, casting golden flickers over the old stonework. Boone snored gently by the stove. Walter poured himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. Rain ticked against the windows, steady as an old watch. He reached for his fountain pen, one Martha had given him back when letters meant more than emails, and began filling out the heritage application by hand. When the world moves too fast, he murmured, roots matter more than wings. It was something Martha used to say when the neighbors traded porches for plastic decks and fenced off their yards with aluminum. The next morning, Elliot posted the first version of their new site, harlancabin.org. It was simple but sharp, photos of the documents, a short video explaining the cabin's history, and a place to subscribe for updates. Walter didn't know much about websites, but he knew pride when he saw it. Around noon, Boone barked at the front gate. Walter stepped outside and saw a bright yellow paper pinned to the fence with blue painter's tape. HOA stationery again. He tugged it off and read the bold lines. Notice of escalation. Failure to comply within 5 calendar days will initiate community-funded corrective action as authorized by Section 4B of the HOA. Walter folded the flyer slowly, his jaw tightening. Community-funded action, he muttered. That's just another word for hired strangers. Inside, he handed the paper to Elliot. They're not done pushing. Neither are we, Elliot said. 2 days later, the phone rang just after supper. Monsieur Ramirez's voice was clear but breathless. I've spoken to the state office. Your application meets all emergency heritage criteria. They are granting temporary protection status, effective immediately. No one can touch that cabin. Walter let out a low exhale and glanced at the fireplace. The photograph above the mantel caught the light just so, and the past felt like a handshake he'd finally return. The next morning, as he stepped onto the porch, he found a new flyer fluttering on the fence rail. All right, public hearing. Item 1, emergency measures for non-compliant structures. Funny how a road can belong to everyone until someone checks the deed, Walter said, laying a yellowed map across the kitchen table. His voice was calm, but his fingers lingered at the fold where Maple Lane curved, then broke, right into his property line. The map was brittle, the kind of paper that remembered more than any man ever could, and Elliot leaned in, eyes narrowing. It was late October now, and the air had turned sharper. A breeze blew dry leaves against the windows like whispers, too soft to catch. Inside the cabin, the table was covered with maps, deed copies, and legal printouts Elliot had been digging through all morning. Walter moved a mason jar of pens to one side and tapped the section marked 1958. Your great-grandfather signed off on this when the county paved the road, but see this note? Temporary access easement. Revocable upon private objection. They never recorded a permanent right-of-way. Elliot squinted, then looked up slowly. Wait. This road cuts through your land? Doesn't that mean? Walter nodded. They've been driving through Harlan property for 65 years without once asking for permission, and with our cabin now under state review, I reckon that puts us in a mighty strong position. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, and stepped onto the porch with Boone trailing behind. Across the street, an HOA volunteer in a safety vest took a photo of the cabin with a tablet. Walter didn't wave, and the volunteer didn't linger. Later that day, Walter placed a call to Miss Ramirez. I found something in the original land files, he explained. An easement granted for a road. Temporary, never formalized. Her voice crackled with restrained interest. If that easement was never codified, and your land is pending state designation, you have the right to restrict access, at least temporarily. That includes Maple Lane? If the portion in question runs through your deed, yes. But tread carefully. It'll raise tempers. Walter glanced out the window. They've been raised already. That evening, with Elliot's help, he hammered a hand-painted sign into the soil near the start of the lane. Private easement under review, expect delays. 2 days later, the flyer came. Taped aggressively to the mailbox, it bore Charlene's signature in proud script. HOA Motion 22B requesting cabin designation as a neighborhood safety hazard due to aged structure and potential road obstruction. Safety hazards, Walter read aloud. Guess they finally dropped the aesthetic argument. Elliot handed him a cup of tea. They're desperate, Walter grunted. Desperate people do foolish things. On Sunday, Red and Ginny stopped by with a homemade pecan pie. They sat on the porch for a while watching clouds roll in, Boone sleeping at their feet. I remember when this road was just a dirt path, Ginny said, cutting a slice. Didn't bother a soul. Red nodded, and no one asked who owned what, they just waved as they passed. Walter smiled faintly. Maybe it's time they start asking again. The next morning he walked into the post office with a sealed manila envelope and paid for certified delivery. Inside, a formal notice to the HOA board, requesting immediate cessation of any further compliance contact until legal and historical review was completed. By midweek, whispers started circulating. At the diner, a neighbor asked if it was true Walter could block the road entirely. At the library, someone slid an old photo of the original dirt trail under the door of Miss Ramirez's office. That evening, Walter visited the town's war memorial. He stood for a long while beneath the names etched in stone, many of them familiar from family tales. He didn't bring flowers, just thoughts. Back at the HOA board meeting, Charlene was reviewing a printed agenda when a staffer handed her a new envelope. Thick, stamped in red. State Historical Review preliminary approval granted. Charlene clutched her clipboard like a sword as she marched toward the HOA town hall, ready for war. Her heels clicked sharply across the concrete, and her lips formed a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, a few board members followed with hesitant steps, the autumn wind tugging at their name badges. The community center lawn had been dressed up for the occasion. Rows of folding chairs sat beneath maple trees glowing red and orange. A lemonade stand offered paper cups beside trays of apple slices and pumpkin muffins. The air was crisp, the kind of afternoon that usually made neighbors linger, but today conversations were clipped, glances furtive. Walter and Elliot arrived quietly, Boone in tow. Walter wore his best flannel under a gray cardigan, and Elliot carried a small canvas bag with a laptop and a flash drive. Ginny and Red waved them over to sit. Mabel Lane, her silver hair pinned back in a tidy twist, was already perched near the front. Walter leaned toward Elliot. When someone builds their kingdom on control, he murmured, all it takes is a single law to crack it. The meeting began promptly at 2. Charlene stood beneath a portable canopy labeled Maple Lane HOA Leadership, her clipboard held high. We are here today, she said with the firm tone of a sermon, to address the misuse of historical loopholes being wielded against our peaceful community. She didn't name Walter, but all eyes shifted to him. This cabin, she continued, has become a symbol not of heritage but of hostility. Its owner has filed for legal protections to block our main access road. He's spreading fear and division under the guise of preservation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Walter stood slowly, removing his cap. He didn't raise his voice. The cabin was here before electricity, before HOA fees, before someone decided porch swings were a violation. He held up a faded photograph of the original structure, then a copy of the war log. This isn't a weapon. It's a memory that wants to be kept intact. Elliot stepped forward and connected his laptop to the projector on the folding table. The screen lit up with their website. Here's the timeline, he said, clicking through slides. All of it verified, maps, field logs, letters, expert statements. Charlene tried to interrupt, but Mabel Lane stood abruptly. Her voice quavered, but her words were sharp. You fined me $300 for painting my porch rosewood, said it didn't match seasonal tones. That was 2 months after I lost my husband. The crowd stilled. I was grieving, she said, and you sent me a letter about paint. Charlene's jaw tightened. We have standards. Red raised his hand. You made me cut down my birdhouse because it was too whimsical? My grandson built it. More voices joined in. Stories of fines, citations, demands to repaint fences, remove wind chimes, take down flags that weren't HOA approved. Charlene's veneer began to crack. I built this neighborhood's order, she snapped, face reddening. Without me there would be chaos. She threw her clipboard onto the lawn, papers scattered like dry leaves. You think this is over? You fools, all of you." Gasps spread. Someone's phone camera captured the moment. Charlene stormed off the lawn, muttering to herself. A few board members stood frozen. Others quietly gathered the loose pages and set them aside. Walter remained still, hands folded, eyes on the now empty canopy. Mrs. Hensley from the local paper scribbled in her notepad, lips pursed thoughtfully. "Well," she said aloud to no one in particular, "that's going to be a headline." The meeting dissolved into loose conversations. Residents drifted toward Walter, some with questions, some with nods. Ginny offered him a fresh cup of cider. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, Mr. Langley approached Elliot, his expression tight. He glanced around, then slipped a thick envelope into Elliot's hand. "Old HOA records," he muttered. "You didn't get them from me." "The only thing HOA feared more than history," Elliot said, opening the envelope, "was a calculator." The fire crackled behind him as he pulled the folded sheets onto the cabin's kitchen table, each page slightly curled and stained at the corners. Walter watched in silence, arms crossed, steam curling from the chipped mug between his hands. Outside, the wind rustled dry leaves across the porch, but inside the cabin, it was all paper and purpose. Elliot spread the documents out slowly. Monthly statements, vendor names, payment logs, some handwritten, others printed in outdated fonts. Boone, curled up nearby, didn't stir as Walter reached for a page marked Landscaping, $3,425.00. Seasonal rebalancing. "What the hell is seasonal rebalancing?" Walter asked. Elliot snorted. "I think it means overpaying someone to trim bushes and call it art." They kept going, 3 different line items for community aesthetic consultation, the same contractor name appearing under separate company titles. Entire months where the expense logs were one vague line, beautification, $6,100.00. Walter leaned back and rubbed his jaw. "I remember Charlene saying once, beautification isn't cheap, but no one checks the math." Thought she was being dramatic. Elliot flipped a page. She was being careful. By morning the table looked like a crime board from a detective show. Lines drawn, totals circled, yellow post-its with notes in Elliot's handwriting. When Mr. Langley stopped by mid-morning, his eyes widened at the sight. "You weren't kidding," he muttered. "I always assumed we had oversight, but I never saw this." Walter gestured to a seat, "Then help us set it right." Langley sat, pulled out a notepad, and started pointing at entries he remembered, names he didn't recognize. "That's a shell company," he said at one point. "Used to be Charlene's cousin's business, I think." The next afternoon, Walter and Elliot brought everything to Miss Hensley at the newspaper office downtown. She flipped through the files slowly, jaw tightening by degrees. "This isn't just sloppy," she said. "It's coordinated." "We're not accusing," Walter said. "We're showing." Miss Hensley nodded. "Understood. Give me 2 days. It's going in Sunday's paper." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the cabin was once again lit by lamplight and fire, Elliot poured 2 cups of tea. Walter took his without a word. They sat in companionable quiet, Boone's breathing steady in the background. "You think we're doing the right thing?" Elliot finally asked. Walter looked at the pages again. "Whatever happens, we stood up." Sunday morning arrived with fog and frost. The town woke slowly, but by 9 a.m. phones began to buzz. From fine to fraud, read the headline. Beneath it, a 3-column spread of charts, invoices, and cautious but clear reporting on Maple Lane HOA's spending history. By noon, Walter had received 5 phone calls, 3 from neighbors, 1 from the county clerk, and 1 from Ms. Remenez, who simply said, "Told you legacy matters." At 2 o'clock, an envelope arrived in the mailbox. "Legal warning. Cease and desist." From the office of Charlene Prescott, HOA president. Walter read it silently. Then he folded it in half and handed it to Elliot. "What now?" Walter looked out the window, where the last of the golden leaves clung to the trees. "Let the facts speak." The next morning, 2 government sedans pulled up in front of Charlene's house. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains as 2 agents stepped onto the porch. One of them rang the bell and held up a leather badge. "Ma'am, we need to talk about your HOA disbursements." The scent of apple cider and wood smoke drifted across the yard as neighbors gathered beneath the hand-carved sign, Cabin Heritage Day as 2024. Children in knit caps ran between hay bales stacked near the front steps, laughing and kicking leaves, while their parents sipped cider from steaming mugs and listened to the soft twang of a banjo trio under a canvas tent. The cabin, with its fresh coat of linseed oil and garlands of dried corn husks, had never looked prouder or more at home. Walter stood off to one side, watching the scene with hands tucked into his coat pockets. He hadn't expected this many people. Red and Ginny had brought pumpkin pie, of course. Mabel Lane arrived with a crock of elderberry preserves. Mr. Langley, looking lighter than he had in weeks, was helping the schoolteacher from Maple Elementary set up a table with coloring books for the kids. Inside the cabin, Elliot moved through small groups, giving quiet explanations about the history behind the artifacts on display. He pointed out the framed 1864 letter above the mantel and showed the kids where a cannonball dented one of the floorboards, though whether the dent was really from a cannonball or a century of wear was left politely unanswered. The children didn't care. Their eyes were wide, and their questions spilled out like marbles. Was it really a hospital? Did horses sleep here? Is that a real musket? Elliot answered each one patiently, a quiet pride softening the edges of his voice. In the far corner, Miss Ramirez stood holding a thin leather-bound folder. She caught Walter's eye and nodded. He stepped forward. "Mr. Harlan," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hush, "on behalf of the State Preservation Office, I am proud to officially present your cabin with its State Heritage certification." The applause came, gently at first, then grew warm and earnest. Walter took the folder, opened it with shaking hands, and scanned the printed words. Gavin Harlan Est 1864 State Protected Heritage Site. Boone barked once, softly, as if even the dog understood the weight of it. Just then the veterans group stepped forward. One man in a worn navy jacket handed Walter a wooden plaque, carved with care. "For preserving the stories too often forgotten," he said. "For reminding us where we come from." Walter cleared his throat, but didn't speak yet. He looked toward the road where a familiar silver sedan idled at a distance. Charlene sat behind the wheel, sunglasses hiding her eyes, unmoving. No one waved. She didn't get out. A few minutes later, the schoolteacher tapped the microphone. "Mr. Harlan, would you say a few words?" Walter stepped to the center, his hat tucked under his arm. The air was crisp, the leaves overhead, golden and still. "This land stood through storms," he said, his voice steady. "So did we." There was silence, then applause again. Stronger this time. Elliot moved to stand beside him. Someone snapped a photo. Boone sniffed at the veteran's boots before circling the porch once and settling near Walter's feet. As the crowd slowly dispersed, chatting and lingering over pulled pork sandwiches and pie, Elliot filmed a few final shots for what he said might be the start of a short documentary. Just for the school, he said, but his grin said more. The sun had nearly set when Walter stepped back into the cabin. The smell of cider clung to the doorway. On the table sat the usual pile of circulars, but something stood out. A thick manila envelope marked in red, Private Counsel, Legal Action Threat. He picked it up, heavy as a rock in his hand. Walter stood by the gate at dawn on Veterans Day, hands clasped behind his back, the plaque glinting beneath a pale Carolina sky. The air was cool and still, laced with wood smoke and the distant crackle of someone else's fireplace. Overhead the first light caught the curve of the brass letters, Cabin Harlan, 1864. State Protected Heritage Site. Behind him the cabin windows glowed soft with lamplight. Boone sniffed along the fence line, tail slow and steady. Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. Inside, Elliot poured coffee and added a splash of milk the way Walter liked. On the table sat the envelope they'd received a week ago, bold red stamp, Private Counsel, Legal Action, Threat. The paper inside was thick, expensive. The wording was theatrical. Elliot had read it twice and declared it toothless. A cease and desist without jurisdiction is just a tantrum in legal stationery, he'd said. Now Walter slid the letter into a folder labeled Final Notices Resolved, clipped a copy to an email and sent it off to the State Attorney General's office. Just for the record, by mid-morning the yard had begun to stir. Folding chairs appeared, carried by neighbors. A few early visitors wandered the perimeter, reading the handmade signs Elliot had put together for his walking tour. This window rebuilt from 1864 timber. This wall once held a Union medical cot. Miss Hensley stopped by with a notepad and a thermos of spiced tea. "Mind if I sit in on the kids' tour later?" "Long as you don't correct the cannonball story," Elliot said with a grin. Laughter rippled across the porch. As noon approached, news began to filter through phones and whispers. A community vote had officially passed. Maple Lane HOA was dissolved. Charlene's property, once the crown jewel of uniform perfection, had quietly gone on the market. No one knew where she'd gone. No one asked. Walter read the alert on Elliot's phone and nodded once. "She already did," he said. "The land just said no." A small envelope arrived by mail courier that afternoon, delivered by hand. Inside, a letter from the North Carolina Museum of Rural History. We'd be honored to archive the original cabin documents. You've done more than preserve a structure, you've protected a story. Elliot, cheeks pink from the cold, stood on the porch with a letter in one hand and a university pamphlet in the other. I applied, he said. Historic preservation and public history. I figured, well, if we're keeping stories alive, I might as well learn how to do it right. Walter smiled and offered him the other half of his biscuit. Then I reckon you'd better start practicing. That evening, as lanterns were lit and marshmallows browned over little fire pits, Elliot presented Walter with a surprise, a framed poster printed on thick matte paper, the title in bold script. The Last Cabin, A Story of Roots and Resistance. At the bottom, a film by Elliot Harlan. Walter ran a thumb along the edge of the frame. Guess you really are making history now. He turned back toward the gate and reached for the final piece he'd been carving all month. With slow care, he mounted it beside the brass plaque. The letters were hand-chiseled, sanded smooth, and stained to match the porch wood. Welcome to Harlan Cabin, protected by history, preserved by love. Boone circled the rocking chair and settled with a groan. Walter eased into the seat, the fire already glowing inside. From the yard came the soft sound of Elliot's voice, recording the first group of wide-eyed schoolkids for his documentary. The past was safe, the future remembered. On a quiet hill in Carolina where smoke curled from chimneys and children's laughter echoed between the trees, one stubborn cabin stood tall, not because it defied change, but because it remembered. What began as a battle over paint colors and property lines became a lesson in how power left unchecked can forget its place. But with truth in hand and neighbors by his side, one man reminded his town that laws are meant to protect, not punish, and that history isn't just what we preserve in wood and stone, but what we pass down in courage. Like a lantern in a dark hallway, justice only needs one steady flame to guide the way.